Welcome to Almost Here, Round the Corner Future Technology podcast with Richard Jacobs. Future technologies poised to transform our lives for better or worse are the focus of this podcast. Almost here means these technologies are now here and starting to be used, or just around the corner, from Bitcoin to artificial intelligence, 3D printing, blockchain, virtual reality, and more.
Hello, this is Richard Jacobs with the Future Tech Podcast. My guest today is Jolene Creighton. She's the founding editor-in-chief of Futurism. It's an online publication that talks about future topics and science and things like that. So, Jolene, how are you doing today?
I'm great. Thanks so much for having me. It's fantastic to be here remotely, I suppose, since I'm just on the line.
Yeah, that's great. So tell me about Futurism. What was your idea when you first, created the publication and, started out as the editor?
Well, I'm a science writer, a journalist, and I actually had a publication called From Quarks to Quasars that focused a lot more on astronomy and physics and all of that wonderfulness. And I got connected to Alex Klokas through a mutual friend. He is the CEO of Futurism, and he had at the time a couple of other people who were founding members who were on board. There was a president, Dan Cetera, and then the chief technology officer, Jordan Lejeune. And they needed someone to come on and oversee all of the editorial content. And the basic concept was a lot of people are talking about science and technology, but what really seems to be missing is informed conversations about what this really means for the everyday individual and how these things are, as we speak, reshaping politics and how we interact with one another and education and really just every aspect of society. And so that was really the idea behind Futurism, to really focus on the so what. So what does this mean for us and for our society and our world? And, what do these developments say about where we are heading or where we're potentially heading? So that's basically Futurism in a nutshell. And that was roughly 3 years ago, a little over 3 years ago now that we launched.
And have things changed since then, or is the focus still the same?
At Futurism?
Mm-hmm.
Yep. So the publication still focuses on science and technology and how it's reshaping our world. So we don't really cover stuff like new iPhone launches or, product updates for iPhones and tablets and so on. We focus a lot more on larger disruptive things that pose potentially existential threats to society. So artificial intelligence, CRISPR gene editing, blockchain, and things of that nature.
Yeah, I tend to focus on the same stuff here, but more just the excitement of it and the technologies that people think may be far away, but they're not far away. They're actually here and they're in use, at least somewhat.
Yeah, I mean, especially you talk about artificial intelligence and self-driving cars. I mean, they're not 10 years away. They're not even 5 years away. They're here now. Uber has them driving on streets in Phoenix and I believe in places in California. China is launching a number of different services. A lot of places are already testing out the technology. And I've noticed since Futurism launched, there's actually been quite a few other publications that have started really focusing on the future. So, Forbes and Washington Post and a bunch of other different outlets all have dedicated sections specifically to the future and how it impacts the world. The future and how science and technology are reshaping it.
Yeah. Well, I think we're just starting to see more and more popular culture. All these aspects come into fruition, and all these technologies that are really starting to take off. VR has had a resurgence. AI has all of a sudden had a resurgence. 3D printing, a lot of patents have expired, and now it's becoming more widespread. So it just seems like the future is suddenly here. It's kind of funny,
Yeah, well, it has a lot to do with the pace of change, which I know everyone talks about a lot, but with the advent of the computer and the way that our technologies are just shrinking year after year after year, which allows us to basically pack more power into smaller and smaller devices. And it just allows us to do so much more. And the pace of that it just keeps going. Um, and and so these disruptions are just getting more and more widespread. I mean, at this point, they've reached, nearly every place on the globe. I mean, it's just half a century ago, trying to, understand news on a global scale was something that was extremely, extremely difficult just because the nature of the news cycle and how long it took to get information out there. But now with YouTube, you can live stream an event, I mean, as it's happening to just everyone on the planet. It's just, it's really amazing.
Yeah. There was a book by Alvin Toffler from years ago called, I think, Future Shock. And he talked about the pace of innovation in different industries. And, of course, like government and education was, probably some of the last and the slowest. But it's really, future creep is really invading everything we do. I think that's why we're seeing more of it. Like you said, it's accelerating.
Yeah, and the problem, because you'd mentioned, education and the various places that are often the last to sort of reap the benefits of technological developments. And I think one of the issues with technology is that I was at a summit last year, and they had a bunch of individuals from the Department of Defense there, and they were talking, the topic was artificial intelligence and what its role is in government. And people were, asking these government officials how the United States is incorporating technologies into their systems, so like HR and basic processing like that. And their responses were really quite shocking. And they basically said that because of all of the red tape and the pace at which the government moves and all of the hurdles you have to surmount in order to get these things adopted on a really basic level, that they are just decades behind where technology actually is. And I think that's why we started to see more and more private industry really starting to step up and fulfill these gaps where the government just isn't able to keep pace. So, kind of jumping topics, but SpaceX is a great example, and how they're doing all of these, rocket launches and, reusable rockets, and going to be ferrying individuals to the International Space Station for NASA. And they're just, private investors are able to accomplish things that the government just can't because of the pace at which it moves.
Yeah, well, they'll also, push government towards adopting technologies faster, select ones. It'll help cut through the bureaucracy a little bit, I think.
Yeah, it does. And it's interesting, the back and forth, like, self-driving cars. One of the major hurdles, indeed probably the major hurdle to realizing self-driving cars, based on the researchers that I've spoken to, is not a technological barrier, but rather it is working out the regulations that will govern self-driving cars, and parallel to that, or along the same lines, the regulations that should be built into the systems themselves. So the ethics that will basically guide how they make decisions when it comes to life or death scenarios.
Any examples of some of the, maybe we could step through that. So any examples of some of the ethics or decisions that you know of that baked into self-driving cars or being considered?
So for example, I mean, the one that people always talk about is just the really basic one, which is if a car is driving down the road and it is going to crash into someone, but it can avoid the collision and save the other individual's life by, say, going off the road, or going into the other lane or something like that, and putting the driver's life at more risk. Should the self-driving car do that? Like, is the obligation to protect other individuals, or is the obligation of the self-driving car to protect the driver? And I believe it was Radiolab actually did a really interesting podcast on this topic exclusively. And the research has found that individuals, they want the self-driving car to protect them. But of course, we can't just have self-driving cars do what we want. And then along those same lines, once you know what the car is going to do, so whether or not it's going to protect the pedestrian or protect the driver or so on, then you come down to the question of, okay, well, who is at fault when a self-driving car does eventually kill someone? I mean, we've already had one individual get hit during a test and killed by a self-driving car. And although even the most modest projection shows that self-driving cars are going to dramatically reduce accidents and deaths caused by cars, they're still going to happen. And so figuring out who's responsible. Is it the driver, the individual who is behind the wheel, even though they're not technically driving? Is it the person who programmed the machine? Those are the difficult ethical questions that currently policymakers and researchers are trying to figure out how to navigate so that we can realize these technologies like self-driving cars on a large scale.
Yeah, or the fact that, if and when self-driving cars prove themselves to have an accident rate that's a half or a third less than human drivers, will there be legislation that does not allow you to drive on your own except in emergencies or at all?
Yeah,
you have to use a
that's the
self-driving
other
car.
thing. Yeah, and that's because a lot of people, again, like the research across the board shows that self-driving cars will eventually reduce accidents just because machines can respond so much faster than humans can. Now, we obviously have a bit more to go, technologically speaking, in order to get self-driving cars to the point to where they can respond in all situations. Which is why we don't have them, just driving everywhere currently. But despite the fact that research shows that they're going to reduce accidents and deaths, individuals in surveys, I think it was like 80%, it was an overwhelming majority, said that even if research has proven that self-driving cars, are able to successfully drive and navigate and can do so better than humans, they still wouldn't trust a car, a machine, to take the wheel. And so how we're going to need to think very seriously about how we're going to prepare for that, because it's one thing for the government to say, okay, no one can drive anymore. Cars, have to be the drivers. It's another thing to get society to accept that. And that's actually a large reason of why I think that futurism is so important, and why the communication about these technologies and how they're impacting us is so absolutely necessary. Because what we don't want is something where people are afraid of these technologies, where we have something that can objectively reduce harm and objectively save lives, and we don't use the technology because we're afraid of it. One example is vaccines. People, it's still a debate in society about whether or not vaccines cause autism, but it is not, and it has not been a debate in the sciences for a very, very long time. And so the more information we can get out there about these technologies, the better I think people will be prepared for the future and more willing to accept things that make their lives better and protect their lives and the lives of their loved ones.
Yeah, no, that's good insight. Yeah, I was going to ask you, so, I'm sure you've seen hundreds or thousands of different future technologies and endeavors, which is a cool benefit of being a part of a publication like Futurism.
Yeah.
So what in particular has really touched you, excited you or bothered you or just, influenced your thinking over the past, few years you've been involved with it?
Well, one that has really, really excited me is the reusable rockets. First off, they're just amazing to see a rocket take off, travel to outer space, and then touch back down on Earth and somehow land upright. These things are just absolutely mammoth. It is just a feat of epic proportions. And it dramatically reduces the cost of spaceflight. And what that means from a practical standpoint is that it's no longer national governments who are the only ones who have access to space. The price reduction is so great that everyday individuals can launch experiments to space. aboard, a SpaceX rocket, or eventually aboard, perhaps Blue Origin's rocket, or any other number of private industries that spring up over the next, few years or decades, and do tests, and eventually, Blue Origin specifically is working on space tourism, and just the idea that individuals who aren't trained astronauts could, in the very near future, in the order of years, take a day trip to space is just so awe-inspiring, I think. So yeah, hands down, reusable rockets, I think, are one of the things that just are absolutely astounding.
Any other technologies that, and maybe the other side of things, not astounding, but stuff that you really don't like, but it's important to talk about.
So
I'll
I have
give you
a
an
really,
example,
really...
like the social credit system in China. That's one of those things that really bothers me. That we don't have to talk about that, but it's just an example. But what's that for you?
No. That's actually a great one, though. We did a fairly extensive article on it at Futurism, and this goes back to sort of the ethics that we build into our technologies. So there's obviously an issue with the social credit system, which, if individuals aren't familiar, basically China is creating an algorithm that rates citizens according to how good of a citizen they are. Now, of course, this is a serious issue from a surveillance standpoint, because the idea is that the government will monitor literally everything that you do and then make decisions that impact whether or not you can travel to other countries, whether or not you can get a loan for a house, what schools your children can get into. But more realistically, it influences the ethical decisions that we make on a day-to-day basis. And to me, that's what's so perverse and frightening about this. One of the things that an individual that we spoke with, who was working with the team that's building the algorithm that China is going to use, one of the things that they mentioned is that if an individual buys, say, diapers at the store, the system will recognize that, and because, quote, parents tend to be more responsible individuals, it will give them a better score. Now, the idea there is that having a child is somehow a moral act. That's basically what we're telling people by building the algorithm in this way. It's just, I can't imagine a future in which people are literally having kids to increase their citizenship score, but that's quite literally the road that China is taking. That's terrifying. And it's not just China, though, that's using algorithms and I don't know, technologies that are in ways that are somewhat questionable. This is a timely topic, and I'm sure also very, very controversial. But I was reading the other day about an app that a company is working on. I can't remember the name of it. Basically, a consent app to give consent for sexual intercourse. The idea is that two individuals sign on to this app, and it asks a series of questions about your boundaries and what you're willing to commit to, and then you both sign off on it. Now, I guess in a basic sense, it could be a way to ensure that individuals are on the same page and helping to foster communication. And I don't want to talk about, hacking concerns or anything like that. But of course, individuals, you can change your mind at any time. And apps just don't account for that and can't account for that. So one of the things that I'm also concerned about is that we're trying to automate things or incorporate technologies in ways that just don't make sense, and could actually be quite detrimental if you take it to its logical conclusion.
No, there's good and bad. For the most part, I think these technologies are good, but there are some serious possible consequences. Like the social credit app, just to say one more thing about it, that also affects who you're friends with in social credit. So if I'm friends with you and your score goes lower, I'm encouraged not to associate with you because I look bad associating with you with a lower score, which is terrible. So it's like crazy social engineering, and it's just an awful thing.
And that's why these questions about who is going to be the one making decisions, and how are we going to implement these technologies are so important. It's stuff that they're the questions that we try and tackle at Futurism by speaking with researchers who are studying the technology from a philosophical and societal standpoint, the researchers and scientists who are actually working to build the technologies, and government policymakers, because it's not an easy question to answer, because if you put technology in the hands of the state, you could go down paths like China. Social engineering and surveillance become serious questions. But then, of course, should it just rest in the individual who makes it? Because that's also fraught with a lot of questions and concerns and problems, because then we're assuming that the individual who makes the technology is going to have society's best interests at heart, which, as we've seen through social media giants like Facebook, certainly isn't always the case. Often they're driven by money. So I think we need a really careful balance of government influence and individual feedback in order to ensure that these technologies are adopted safely, and ultimately they do benefit society, because the potential is so great, it's so promising. But across industries, from biotechnology and gene editing to space flight and reusable rockets and AI weapons, the threat is also very real.
Definitely, yeah. So what is it, it's kind of a silly question, but what does it feel like to be you? You're looking at all this new technology all the time. You're being exposed to things that most people are never exposed to, which is really cool. When you interact with friends and family, or you're just out and about, you have your own perspective because you've seen all this stuff. What is the real world and people that aren't in the know, what are they like to you versus you? What do you know that they don't, and what has that done to your interactions?
Well, I think, honestly, it's a small thing, I suppose. But one of the things that I have noticed the difference between kind of myself and individuals who maybe don't have as firm an understanding of science and technology, is I'm not afraid. There are serious concerns with technology, as we were just talking about. But when a lot of publications and a lot of news outlets talk about these technologies, they are in catastrophic ways. They always seem to travel down the path of doom. And, we hear, it seems like every time someone writes or speaks about artificial intelligence, they immediately jump to Skynet or to, Terminator or some other apocalyptic scenario. And most is just completely and totally unrealistic. Even if something bad does happen, it's generally not in the way that we expect. So I'm not afraid of an AI apocalypse or something like that. What I am afraid of is the things that we see Facebook doing, which is curating the news and information that people get. Now, that's also an application of artificial intelligence, and it's a very insidious one. And I think one of the reasons that it is so detrimental is because people don't recognize it. They don't see it. They're looking for, some gene-edited monster. I mean, Rampage, this movie with Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson, just came out, and the premise is literally that an ape gets hit with CRISPR gene editing, and suddenly it's 30 feet tall. That's the stuff that people are looking for.
I remember. Yep.
That's completely unrealistic.
Right.
The stuff that we need to be wary of is often far, far simpler and more mundane, and in fact, stuff that we can easily protect ourselves from, and manage. And I think that's one of the things that we really always try to communicate at Futurism, what the actual threats really are and what people need to know and be informed about in order to protect yourself where you can and where you do in fact need to, and what to let go of, what you don't actually have to be worried about or afraid of. So yeah, basically just the hype, I suppose. It's really, really easy to not get involved in that and to see when something is being oversold. So a lot of times I'll see society and people around me. An article will come out or a new technology and news will come out about it, and everyone will be, kind of freaking out. And it's just, yeah.
Yeah, no, I agree. I've also seen that certain technologies that, they may be hyped in an article or in the press, and then if you actually experience them, unfortunately, they're far lamer or they're less far along than the article seems to say.
Yeah. Another example is virtual reality. Have you ever tried a VR device?
Yeah, I've tried several of them. CES and various places.
Yeah, and a lot of people that I've met actually haven't. The best that they've ever had would be, like the little, I don't know, I can't remember what Google called it, the little Google box, basically, where you just, put your phone in this like viewfinder type device, and it kind of makes things look, relatively 3D and VR-esque, but it's really not true virtual reality. And the first one
Google
that I tried
Cardboard,
was Google Cardboard. That's it. Yeah. It just does not do the technology justice at all. The first one that I really tried was the Oculus Rift, and it's really just mind blowing. I do think that there's a little ways we have to go yet in order to really have VR come into its own. I think one of the largest barriers is A, the price, and then B, the fact that a lot of devices are still currently tethered to a PC. And so you're limited in how far you can move, which obviously, limits how the game or, whatever it is, whether it's a VR movie, can be designed. But again, technology is accelerating at such a rate. Devices are getting smaller and smaller, and already Intel and a number of other organizations are or have launched devices that operate untethered. It's just going to take a little bit for the price of those to come down to where the everyday individual can really afford it. But it was just so mind-blowing the first time I tried virtual reality.
Yeah, I remember when I went to Japan a year ago, and I was looking for Bitcoin because I heard, supposedly that Bitcoin was everywhere there. But I didn't cover the whole country, certainly, but I didn't really see it.
Yeah.
It seems like it was hyped.
That's and I think a lot of the publications, if I remember correctly, a couple of years ago, were talking about, virtual reality is fantastic, but they're talking about that in similar ways to cryptocurrencies and blockchain technologies, as though they were going to, be just taking over the world on the order of a year or so. And that hasn't quite happened, as I said, largely, I think, due to the price. But it's the same with blockchain. It is a very disruptive force, but we don't have a lot of dApps applications that certainly everyday individuals aren't using. Most people don't have the first idea of what blockchain is or why it is so potentially disruptive and revolutionary. And we don't really have, there's no current real utility beyond cryptocurrencies, at least for the everyday individual. So but yeah, oh my gosh, publications are writing about that, and hype is definitely an issue in that industry in particular.
So, a silly question is, what is the future of futurism? Where are you guys headed? Or are you just are you going in the stream of wherever technology is taking you?
That's the basic idea. So we have a couple of sections that we cover. There's artificial intelligence, biotechnology, so human augmentation, blockchain. And a couple of years ago, we covered blockchain far less, but consensus and a number of ventures and startups have really started investing in the space. And as a result, people are covering it more, so individuals are becoming more informed. So that's one section that we've dramatically upped the amount of coverage that is done. And people are becoming a lot more informed about that. We tend to just follow whatever the changes are in society. So if There is some new technology created tomorrow that somehow impacts us. I'm sure the publication will begin covering that, because ultimately that's it's what it's all about. It's about covering those disruptions that are fundamentally reshaping the nature of our world and what it means to be human. At its core, that's what futurism is, and hopefully that's what it will always be. So in a large way, it was historically I followed the trends and whatever seemed to be important.
Yeah. Well, very good. So where's the best place for folks to find out more about futurism and read your publications and get involved?
Well, you can go to the website, which is futurism.com. We also have a Facebook page, which is just Futurism on Facebook. We have an Instagram account where we share more, videos and things of that nature, have like a daily science update and stuff like that. We're also on Twitter, basically all of the social media platforms. And we also have an app. So if you go to the App Store, we have one for iPhone and for Android. So you'll find us there as well.
Well, that's great. Well, Jolene, thanks for coming. And it's been a good talk. You're a kindred spirit, literally.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
You have been listening to Almost Here, Around the Corner Future Technology podcast with Richard Jacobs. Subscribe to this podcast, post a review to discover more future technologies that are poised to transform our lives for better or worse, such as Bitcoin, artificial intelligence, 3D printing, blockchain, virtual reality, and more.